The Thornholt Mill, one of the newer mills outside the township of Ulpenhill, and the first place I visited after losing my home. Back when that land first belonged to Amstein, I remember very fondly the way they treated me there. Thornholt Mill is rather important in this area of Glenheim. It's small, but it supplies the surrounding areas with seasonal buffer crops in the event of a bad harvest. And in some places, like the Hermitage just a half a day's journey, it is the sole supplier of flour. The mill is part of the larger estate, owned by a baron by the name of Eric Thornholt, and the property was founded by his father, Ungard. Unlike many millers of the area, Ungard was Elrovian, a man from the lands ruled by the southern Jarls. He knew of Old Amstein and yearned to see its lands. When the opportunity arose to leave, he left everything he knew behind and joined a foreign army. He swore an oath to the local lord of the time, Count Bridenhof. Ulpenhill is one of 3 towns located within the Bridenhof county. Initially, Ungard was posted here as part of the standing garrison. As he stayed, he rose in rank and gained favor with the local viscount, who promised him a title at the end of his commission. Ulpenhill was one of many settlements that found themselves in an unfortunate situation. When Ungard took his position, the ruling king of Amstein had died under suspicious circumstances, and there were no living heirs, leaving the kingdom in a power vacuum. The empty throne left Amstein embroiled in a civil war, as the dukes of Amstein competed against one another for their place on the throne. Skirmishes between counties were common, both between and within the dukedom's borders. One of those skirmishes occurred here in Ulpenhill. Ungard was wounded defending his liege, bringing his commission to an end sooner than the Viscount expected, but accepted nonetheless. Ungard found himself in the possession of land he would soon be toiling, year after year, to keep the people of Ulpenhill fed as they too worked to recover whatever was left of their settlement. As the skirmishes and raids that ravaged Ulpenhill finally concluded following the coronation of King Tobin, Ungard was finally able to begin building his homestead. His injury made it hard to travel to his land, and the work was long and hard. He kept his fields small and focused on keeping the soil as rich as he could, hopefully to maximize yield and minimize labor. When Ungard reached his 30th year, he took a wife, a local woman named Enid. They continued to run the farm as Ulpenhill's wounds healed, and its land began to yield more grain. When they finally had more time to themselves, they got the opportunity to sire their first child, a boy named Eric. As the years went on, they also sired a second child, a daughter named Liv. Eric was a quiet boy growing up, doing as he was told as efficiently as he could. Ungard was glad he didn't have to discipline the boy, as that would also mean chasing him down. And as Ungard's injury began to worsen, he knew that Eric would have no choice but to grow up fast. After it had become painfully apparent that Ungard's dynasty was as large as nature was going to allow, Enid sought out to make life as easy as possible, not just for her and her husband, but also for the children as well. Enid called a few favors and ordered the building of a stable. That way the land could be more easily worked by livestock. Such a development should have come sooner, but it wasn't of Utgard's nature to let someone else, or something else, do his work for him, for that was a sign of weakness, according to his ancestors. Nevertheless, the stable was built, and he did allow it. But he should have known Enid's plans didn't stop there. With the livestock able to help with tilling, seeding and harvesting could be far faster. That meant that more wheat was plucked at the perfect time and went to bread grain rather than cattle feed. Their surplus necessitated the building of a storehouse, the first building built on the property by the family alone, rather than enlisting the help of the village. That being said, Ungard was no architect and neither was Enid. They stacked stones best they could and piled logs atop the walls and threw thatching on top and called it good enough. Good enough was far from the case, as the structure quickly became the place unwanted straw went to be forgotten about. It was useful, however, as a place to store the market carts. The extra space in the storehouse was an excellent addition nonetheless, because the more interior space could be afforded to the 2 children, who were indeed growing up fast. Ungard dreaded the possibility, as he often watched Eric play with sticks outside, that his only son might possibly possess an interest in warfare. Contrastly, he appreciated very much that his daughter, Liv, was in fact the kind of girl to fantasize about royalty, feasts, rose-covered walls, and knights jousting at festivals. Ungard, thankfully, had never seen a joust, but he knew about them. He understood it was natural for young boys and girls to have their fantasies. He remembered himself fantasizing about riding a ship to distant lands to the west. His time in the army taught him everything he needed to know about cavalry, and every time Liv came asking about horses or knights in shining armor, it took a great bit of discipline not to lecture her about the minutiae of military logistics. As the children grew old enough to work in the fields, and it became nearly impossible for Ungard to use his leg, the uneasy nature of King Tobin's rule maintained an everlasting fear that war could be on the immediate horizon. The warrior king was not formally trained in statecraft and made many an enemy in foreign courts. The authority of Amstein was barely recognized by the Jarls of Erovia, who were an immediate threat to Utgard's legacy. You see, if the Elrovians were to invade Amstein and learn that Ungard owned a farm, the Jarls wouldn't think twice about liberating his face from his flesh. Ungard came from a warrior people, and his peers whom he abandoned to serve Amstein were now bannerlords looking to expand their territory as Amstein's weakness became more and more apparent. While Eric was being groomed to take on his father's legacy, Liv became a girl of the town as she grew older, much to the strict protest of her parents. By then, Ungard had been appointed a seat on the Viscount's council, earning him a position of prestige. As was customary, Liv would have to be married to an eligible lord soon, or risk a scandal with some yokel, likely with that tanner's boy. Ungard never understood how that girl could withstand being near such a stench. It was decided then that if Liv wouldn't pick a husband, that Enid would have to pick one for her. Doing so didn't take much time. Their neighbor, a sheepherder with the last name of Mitchard, had just inherited his father's land. It was evident, however, that the boy, about Liv's age, had no idea how to run a rural estate, and often didn't have the money nor wool to produce funds. Enid had approached the Mitchard lad and offered a proposition. For the land he owns, and the sheep within, he would be granted the rights of marriage with Liv. Liv would become the ruler of his estate, and he can live his life however he wished. He accepted without a moment's hesitation. But, you see, there was but one small catch. While it was true this Mitchard boy could live his life as he wished, he was still responsible for the land the sheep were on. And now that Liv's family owned the land, that made Ungard, and soon Eric, barons of Alpenhill. And while Ungard, growing weak as the complications with his leg worsened, saw prosperity and peace for his household, Eric saw nothing but opportunity. Now that he was considered a noble lord, and stood to inherit the barony from his father, Eric began to scheme. A few short years after the marriage saw Ungard's passing, outside the entrance to the mill. The tragedy moved the entire town of Alpenhill and left the Thornholt estate under the charge of Eric, who now sought to expand his household further and possibly take the entire town for himself. I did not know that the family was mourning when I arrived at the Thornholt Mill. Surely I heard the bells of the hermitage ringing. There was only one time it ever did ring. But the fact that everywhere was so serenely quiet didn't give me much help. In a way, I too was mourning. That was at least something we both had in common. And, as a matter of fact, the washouts caused by last night's rain also made me think that perhaps even Mother Nature might have been mourning for this poor old man. I was glad to finally be out of that forest that I used to call home. I always hated how dark it was every day. But soon I found myself encroaching on the knoll on which the Thornholt farm sat upon. And I must admit, by the time I had arrived there that afternoon, I was already starting to feel hungry. You know, now that I think about it, if I had known that Ungard had passed away earlier that week, I probably wouldn't have stopped at that house and asked them for food. But it makes me more grateful now that they hosted me then than I have been before. They were so good, in fact, that they brought me into their home and let me share a meal with them. They truly are a lovely family, and I wouldn't mind visiting them again if it wasn't inappropriate for a king to do so. Perhaps it would be more appropriate for me to invite them for a meal. Squire, fetch me some parchment.